we're going to make some short-term improvements to Jewett, but more importantly at Jewett, we want to actually invest in a significant process where we get the neighbors together and take them through a hands-on design process called a charrette, and get everybody in that neighborhood kind of excited and interested and in agreement, more or less, on what we need to do for the next phase of it. We want to invest in that very specific kind of process. And we definitely want to continue to do the bike path investments in this neighborhood. We just think that for health reasons, for recreational reasons, if our youth and others are going to make the best use of our recreational facilities, we have to give them a way to get there on their bikes, particularly in the warm months. And so those are some of the big things. Long term, we've got some very interesting things going on. One is this thing called hydroponic greenhouses. And you may have heard us talk about this earlier in the year. But we have some momentum going around this. And the idea of these is to create local food, but also to put these at the learning centers so that the teachers in the schools can use them as teaching opportunities for our elementary kids, and probably also at the STEM middle school. We really do believe long-term that there is a need for a new community center in the Upson neighborhood. We want to work with you to figure out exactly where that needs to be, what it needs to include, identify some sites. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Public art in our parks and recreation areas, we think, as we try to help people understand how great a cultural place University Park is, we think actual visible signs of that in public art long-term make a lot of sense. We also are going to work in a variety of ways, and we'll talk about these again later, about how to get increased access to the university's facilities for people from the neighborhood. And that's a tricky thing. More tricky maybe than you know from the inside of the university. I can see that easier. But we've got some ideas about how we're going to do that. And then finally, there's been a lot of feedback about a performance stage at Grace Park, and we'll talk a little bit about how that will work going forward. So those are the kind of big pictures. Let's walk through in detail. You have these plans are in front of you, so you can kind of look at them. Let's start with Boss Park and the Leggett Community Learning Center. And you can see on your plans a little bit, that's not a great drawing up here, and I apologize for the coloring because I did it. But conceptually, we've got a few things. Number one, we've got a pretty good size multi-purpose grass field. People can play frisbee or soccer or maybe a little bit of baseball, any number of things, but it's an open kind of field where people can feel free to do a variety of things. There's a walking track, a rubberized walking track with fitness stations pretty much encircling the park. We think that's going to be very useful to people. We're looking at a play fountain as part of phase one in Boss Park. But we also want to have some game tables, flower beds here, kind of in the entrance places. We're going to fence the whole thing with a low decorative fence. Add trees, some solar lighting, some bike racks in this area probably. But there's also room for a raised bed community garden right here. Some small benches over here. We are absolutely going to invest in an inflatable movie screen, but that can be used at Leggett and Boss, or it can be used here in Mason, or it can be used in Grace Park because it can be transported. And so we think that's a really good idea. And then a new area for small playground, small playground for small children. And that concept may include something called an imagination playground that's done by a national group called Kaboom. They're very interesting. It's the sand, water, and puzzle pieces is the way I want to describe it. But they're funded by the Knight Foundation, and Knight is looking for a couple of good locations here. So that's the phase one recommendations for Boss Park. Looking forward beyond that, assuming things go well with that and people begin to really actively use that park, we think long term we can add things like a small pavilion, a little thing with a roof where people can have their lunch or do family picnics. Maybe some bocce courts, excuse me, in this area over here. One of our hydroponic greenhouses right here that sits pretty close to the school, so that begins to work out. Additional lighting and some public art installations. Programmatically, in Boss Park. We definitely heard from you loud and clear. One of our top vote getters, by the way, in our public meetings, as we added them all together, was that we need more activities for seniors, so we're going to try and figure out how we begin to do this. But these long-term improvements and these program improvements, quite honestly, are going to require funding and partners that are not yet in place. So I want to be very careful to say to you that we don't have the dollars to do all the programming. We don't have the dollars to do the long-term. What we can say we think we can get done right now are those phase one improvements. So youth development, after school and summer kinds of programs, something we want to pursue with partners and try and find additional funding for. We've done some youth camping in this park in the past, and we think it's a pretty good program, so we'll try and do that as well. Community picnics, and maybe an art festival in this part of the neighborhood going forward. Moving on to Mason. What we're looking at in Mason in the phase one recommendations, again, this is the part that we actually think we have money for. Right? Actually reconfiguring this baseball field on the south end, we're sitting right in here. Right? So this is the baseball field down on this end. Reconfiguring this so that it's a very functional and kind of higher quality little league and softball field, but kind of overlapping with a multi-purpose field that is very useful for soccer, organized football. What else are we thinking on that one? That's pretty much it.
Yeah, other summer programs.
But other summer kinds of programs, definitely. We're looking at trying to identify one of the basketball courts, especially in a way that women and girls feel welcome on that particular court, because we have been told that the courts are very male-dominated right now. We do want to add some game tables. And that's, it's chess and checkers, folks. I mean, this is just places where people can, again, do those kinds of things. And the tennis courts right now actually are not sealed. And I don't know how many tennis players we have in the room. Unsealed tennis courts are not much fun to play on, and so that's certainly something we think needs to happen in the phase one. Long-term at Mason, again, this depends on funding and it depends on partners. But long-term, we also think there is room for a small pavilion. We would like to see more electrical outlets that help support events, because we're going to have this really nice big open green space. And frankly, it's a really nice space for events going forward, which in order to do events, you have to have electrical, as we found in Grace Park. So we think that's one of the long-term improvements. We also think there's an opportunity here for a nice rubberized walking path going forward in the long term. But here's the biggie. If we could find the space for and the money for a play fountain and an outdoor pool in this neighborhood, this is where it might happen. But again, that's a big ticket item that we'll have to work on together if people think that's something we ought to pursue. Public art, there needs to be an equipment drop-off area for the organized sports, so we've got to figure out how that all fits in. And again, we think there's a good opportunity for the hydroponic greenhouse. That's actually shown right here on the plan. In terms of program improvements, and again, this is dependent on funding and partners, we really think that given the, I guess I did. We actually talked about improving the sledding hill too. But giving the sledding hill, that this is an interesting place if we were going to do a winter carnival in University Park. And so from a programmatic standpoint, we think that's definitely it. Again, programs for seniors are something we want to pursue in the long term, but we're going to have to find funding and partners to do that. Community picnics this is a perfect place for community picnics. And this is a place that we really think long-term we want to try to encourage the athletic teams from the university to come over and do after-school programs. This is a great facility for this. So longer term, we'll work on those partnerships to move that forward. Moving on to Jewett Park. Phase one, I mentioned earlier that we want to do a longer-term process, but we want to invest in Jewett in the short term as well, if it really could use some help. So what we want to do first and foremost is to get into where we've already got play equipment, kind of fix it up, clean it up, refurbish it, make sure that the base of bolts and everything else is nice and everything else. Just invest in the basics right there without question. Add some game tables up here. Look at some fencing for the back of the park, because we have some issues with too much activity happening